Today we are at Sutta 157, wrongly addressed talk. This sutta is quite a bit. So let me see. Okay, let's see how long the whole thing is. Because a talk is wrongly addressed when, having weighed one type of person against another, it is addressed to these 5 types of persons, then bracket inappropriate types of persons. Part 5. Talk on faith is wrongly addressed to one devoid of faith. The talk on virtuous behavior is wrongly addressed to an immoral person. The talk on learning is wrongly addressed to one of little learning. The talk on generosity is wrongly addressed to a miser. The talk on wisdom is wrongly addressed to an unwise person. So there are these 5. So faith, when you listen, sometimes when you just listen, maybe not so easy to have the whole thing. But when you read, maybe easier, but maybe also not so easy. This 5 is the 性净业定慧. Is it? No, not 性净业定慧. This one is 性界文, 性界思文慧. In the Chinese tradition, we usually have 性界文舍慧. Yeah, but this one is 性界, then no, 性思界文慧. Yeah, 性界思文慧. So the order is not exactly the same, but the content is the same. 性界文舍, oh yeah, it's actually the same. 性界文舍慧. It's like that when I see it. Sometimes when I read, right, the things jump up. Okay, so the first one. And why? Because it's a talk on faith wrongly addressed to one devoid of faith. So I hope you all don't mind. I read halfway, then I talk a bit, because I think when I just read, and if it's a bit long, I think some of you will listen and hear. And why? Because it's a talk. So not that I want to interrupt Buddha's words, okay? Yeah, the past few days I try to read from start to end without my commentary, because out of respect for the text. But something tells me some of you listen halfway, you will just become a wow. Then by the time when I explain and refer to this part or that part, you have no idea what I'm referring to. So I have to break it down into smaller chunks. Okay, so the first one on faith. And why? Because it's a talk on faith wrongly addressed to one devoid of faith. When a talk on faith is being given, a person devoid of faith loses his temper and becomes irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He displays anger, hatred, and bitterness. Yeah, so this is so right. I start talking about wrongly addressed. Yeah, when I look at it initially, I'm like, there must be something interesting here, because usually we say if a person have no faith, then you should talk to the person about faith, to help the person instill faith, right? But this is a case where when you talk to a person without faith, then the person may then lose temper, lose his temper, become irritated, is hostile, or is stubborn, right? You have encountered people like that before, right? Yeah. And sometimes the more you tell them, the more I don't want. Just like when you talk to your kid to ask the kid to study, the more you tell the kid to study, the more I don't want to study. So for what reason? Because he does not perceive that faith in himself and obtain rapture and joy based upon it. Yeah. Therefore, a talk on faith is strongly addressed to a person devoid of faith. So the rest is actually the same sequence. Yeah, basically that the person would become would lose his temper, irritated, hostile, and stubborn. So I'm going to just go through it now. And why is a talk on virtuous behavior wrongly addressed to an immoral person? When a talk on virtuous behavior is being given, an immoral person loses his temper and becomes irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He displays anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he does not perceive that virtuous behavior in himself and obtain rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on virtuous behavior is wrongly addressed to an immoral person. And why is a talk on learning wrongly addressed to a person of little learning? When a talk on learning is being given, a person of little learning loses his temper and becomes irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He displays anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he does not perceive that learning in himself and obtain rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on learning is strongly addressed to a person of little learning. You all see the pattern? Oh, yeah. I think you all should be able to see the pattern now. Yeah. So one thing to take note when you read the Nikayas, there's a lot of repetition. Yeah. The advantage of repetition is that it helps to ingrain the concepts, yeah, in us. Yeah, because you read so many times, you still cannot remember that. Then what can you do, you know? Yeah. But then for some of us, we have another problem. When there's repetition, we zone out. Yeah, even when reading yourself, you zone out. then you zone out, then your interest, yeah, because we're curious about new things. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But then the sutta oftentimes is quite boring. Why? Because repetition. Yeah. So when you read the sutta, like in this case, you may be surprised, how come they never do abridging? Because this would be a good time to abridge, right? Because there's a whole chunk of text that's repeated 5 times, right? But I'm glad they didn't do abridging, because especially when I read to others, I want to read the whole text. Then I have to go and hunt the original verse. Yeah. But when you find text that's repeating, read it slowly and read each paragraph as though it is the first time you read it. Yeah. Don't think the same, but then you just look for the different term. Then you know, I don't know about you, but I have this habit, you know. Once I see a pattern, then I just skip the pattern. Then I just, okay, this one is on sing, this one is on 借, this one is 诗, 文, then 诗, then 会. Yeah. Yeah. So I have this habit. So if you don't have this habit, then no problem. Yeah. So number 4. And why is a talk on generosity wrongly addressed to a miser? When a talk on generosity is being given, the miser loses his temper and becomes irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He displays anger, hatred, and bitterness. And for what reason? Because he does not perceive that generosity in himself and obtain rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on generosity is wrongly addressed to a miser. Then why is a talk on wisdom wrongly addressed to an unwise person? When a talk on wisdom is being given, an unwise person loses his temper and becomes irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He displays anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he does not perceive that wisdom in himself and obtain rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on wisdom is wrongly addressed to an unwise person. The talk is wrongly addressed when having weighed one type of person against another. It is addressed to these 5 inappropriate types of persons. So in a way, we can, apart from these 5 qualities, we can also learn this technique to see whether it is appropriate. Because initially, maybe you don't know. So as you talk to that person, you should observe, 察言观色. Yeah. So you must observe, you must listen to that person's response, you must look at the expression. If the person start to have a blank face, then you must, okay, maybe shift a bit, shift the topic a bit and see what happens, Yeah. That's why when I give Dharma talk, I need people to open their webcam, Otherwise, don't know whether the person's still there or not. Listen halfway. Or listen halfway, go toilet lah, go kitchen lah. Okay, part 2. Bhikkhus. The talk is properly addressed when having weighed one type of person against another. It is addressed to these 5 types of persons. What 5? The talk on faith is properly addressed to one endowed with faith. The talk on virtuous behavior is properly addressed to a virtuous person. A talk on learning is properly addressed to a learned person. A talk on generosity is properly addressed to a generous person. A talk on wisdom is properly addressed to a wise person. And why? Because it's a talk on faith properly addressed to one endowed with faith. When a talk on faith is being given, a person endowed with faith does not lose his temper and become irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He does not display anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he perceives that faith in himself and obtains rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on faith is properly addressed to a person endowed with faith. And why is a talk on virtuous behavior properly addressed to a virtuous person? When a talk on virtuous behavior is being given, a virtuous person does not lose his temper and become irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He does not display anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he perceives that the virtuous behavior in himself and obtains rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on virtuous behavior is properly addressed to a virtuous person. And why is a talk on learning properly addressed to a learned person? When a talk on learning is being given, a learned person does not lose his temper and become irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He does not display anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he perceives that learning in himself and obtains rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on learning is properly addressed to a learned person. And why is a talk on generosity properly addressed to a generous person? When a talk on generosity is being given, a generous person does not lose his temper and become irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He does not display anger, hatred, and bitterness. For what reason? Because he perceives that generosity in himself and obtains rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, a talk on generosity is properly addressed to a generous person. And why is a talk on wisdom properly addressed to a wise person? When a talk on wisdom is being given, a wise person does not lose his temper and become irritated, hostile, and stubborn. He does not display anger, hatred, and bitterness. And what reason? Because he perceives that wisdom in himself and obtains rapture and joy based upon it. Therefore, the talk on wisdom is properly addressed to a wise person, because the talk is properly addressed when having weighed one type of person against another. It is addressed to these 5 types of persons. And that ends Sutta 157. You'll find that in the Nikaya, oftentimes there are 2. This is one type of sutta where it just lists out what works, what doesn't work, but it doesn't directly highlight how to make it work, right? You notice? Yeah. Then there are some suttas that actually explain how to approach such matters. So you'll remember that there are other suttas on speech. Then the Buddha talked about different qualities or different factors to consider before one speak. Yeah, to consider whether our intention. Yeah, to consider whether when you speak, the person is gladdened or become agitated. Yeah, and then to consider when you speak, do you become agitated yourself? And then to check whether your intent is it out of compassion, to check whether is this the appropriate time, and to check whether the person benefit in the end. Yeah, so there are different things to consider. So in other suttas, then the Buddha addressed the factors to consider before you speak. So here in this sutta, in case you wonder like that, then how to solve it? Yeah, this sutta is just to highlight the 5 types of people that you shouldn't be speaking to with respect to these 5 qualities. What are the 5? Yeah, 信、戒、闻、舍、慧。信、戒、闻、舍、慧。Yeah. In other suttas, only 4 qualities are mentioned. 信、戒、施、慧. Yeah. Or 信、戒、舍、慧. The translation here is 施，布施的施, right? Generosity. But in Chinese text, oftentimes the 施，布施的施 becomes 舍. Yeah. 舍 means to relinquish. Yeah. So it's talking about the same thing, but sometimes the translation is used differently. As a general rule, sometimes you have a itchy, like about to come but don't come. Wow, that's the worst. As a general rule, when we try to share not just Dharma, just share anything with people, one of the things you want to consider is the kind of relationship you have with that person. Yeah, is it a cordial relationship? Is there a relationship to begin with? Yeah, if let's say, and even more importantly is the relationship one which you have engaged in conversation before? Yeah. If on a normal day you don't really talk to this person, be it your friend, your colleague, or your parents, or your children, or your spouse, or I mean, of course, some of this we should be talking quite a bit. But if it's talking purely on a professional level, on a very functional level, yeah. If it's just functional, then you try to go beyond the function, yeah, or you try to give suggestions or advice, hard for it to be absorbed, yeah, or accepted. Yeah, the person is unlikely to be receptive. Yeah, so there are many things to consider. Yeah, and that's why sometimes students, when they ask me like, how do they share the Dharma with their parents? I almost never ask them what they share. One of the first thing I ask them is, how is your relationship with your parents? Do you chit-chat with them? Do you spend time with them to begin with? Yeah. This is something I've shared in many talks before. So whether it's with your parents, with your children, with your friends, with your peers, with your colleagues, with anyone, if you have not spent enough time with them, if you have not talked to them enough, when I say talk, I mean listen to them. Yeah, if our idea of talking is always you talk, they listen, it's a bit difficult. Yeah. So of course you may also wonder like, Sifu, you give Dharma talk, are you always talking? But when students ask questions, I need to listen on, Imagine if you all ask questions, but I don't listen to what you ask. You ask halfway, okay, I know already, I know. Would you all even ask again? You probably wouldn't ask again. So this is I think there's no one one special formula, because for everybody it's different. But this is what I observe. These few things to consider. Yeah. Then even if the person don't have faith, yeah, is it possible to talk to the person with faith? Yeah, about faith? It's possible. Yeah, I'm not going against what the Buddha said. Yeah, what the Buddha said is highlighting that if the person would get upset, then talking to the person about faith, about the 5 qualities is not appropriate. Yeah. But there are ways to get the person to become amiable to these topics. Yeah. But why these 5 topics? Because these 5 topics can help them grow in the Dharma. Yeah. It's for their welfare and well-being. Yeah. 信戒闻舍慧. And these 5, you notice for these 5, concentration is missing. Yeah, because this 5 is oftentimes mentioned as a basis, starting point for lay people. Yeah, 信戒闻舍慧. Starting point for lay people doesn't mean that it doesn't apply for monastics, but it just means that this is the entry point or entry point. So notice concentration is not inside. Yes, Phyllis.
Sorry, Sifu, can you the 5 point, can you translate to English? The Chinese a bit.
Oh, it's the same as I have read in the Sutta. Okay, so 信 faith.
Okay.
Yeah, then 戒 they translate as morality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so virtuous or not virtuous. Then 闻 learning. Yeah.
Okay.
That means is a person someone who have learned a lot or learned little, delight in learning or not delight in learning. Yeah. Then is actually generosity, the practice of giving. Is a person miserly? Yeah, that means very stingy. 一毛不拔, one hair you cannot pluck out from him. Yeah. Then the last one is 慧, wisdom. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying on that, because sometimes I forget that some of your kantang and like Lin Toy is not kantang. She's Vietnamese. So Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Put our palms together. 愿消三障诸烦恼，
愿消三障诸烦恼，
愿得智慧真明了，
愿得智慧真明了，
普愿罪障悉消除，
普愿罪障悉消除，
世世常行菩萨道。
世世常行菩萨道。
阿弥陀佛。
陀佛。
Till we meet again, may be guided and protected by the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And as always,
拜乖。
Thank you, Sifu.
Have a 信戒闻舍慧 day ahead.
Okay. Thank
谢谢师父，拜拜，
Okay,
拜拜师父，
okay.
拜拜，
you,
拜拜。
Sifu.
Bye.
师傅，拜拜，
Bye, Lama.
拜拜，拜拜。